Welcome to The Debate, a program that illuminates complex issues by exploring opposing viewpoints found in source material. Today, we're diving into a truly fascinating literary puzzle from the Ivory Gate, the renowned solicitor Mr. Deering and his perplexing alternate persona, the socialist prophet Edmund Gray.
It's a really rich case study, and the central question we're wrestling with is this. Is Mr. Deering's transformation into Edmund Gray a manifestation of a literal psychological condition, or is it, perhaps, a powerful symbolic representation of suppressed ideological dissent within the rigid societal constraints of his world?
Exactly. And my perspective, what I aim to demonstrate today, is that the text overwhelmingly points towards a genuine psychological affliction for Mr. Deering.
And I, on the other hand, will be contending that Deering's transformation is far more powerfully understood as a metaphor for the profound suppression of radical beliefs within a rigid social order, a subtle but quite sharp critique of the Ivory Gate itself.
Well, my initial read of the material, and I think it holds up, strongly supports interpreting Mr. Deering's dual identity as a literal psychological condition, very likely a form of, somnambulism or dissociation. The evidence of his profound memory lapses isn't just incidental. It's explicitly detailed and goes far beyond simple forgetfulness. We hear Deering himself expressing clear distress, saying, "I remember nothing about it," concerning that significant 720-pound payment. Or, even more tellingly, "I cannot remember where I was last night. I am an old man. It is the privilege of age to forget yesterday and to remember 50 years ago." Now, these aren't just convenient narrative quirks. The text portrays them as deeply unsettling personal experiences for Deering. He observes, with a growing sense of, dread, "Sometimes I cannot remember in the morning what I was doing the evening before." And even quite clinically, "I looked at my watch and found that I had been unconscious for 3 hours." His terror at the possibility, if what you suggest is true, then I must be mad, really underscores the literal frightening nature of his condition to him. He seems to be confronting a very real personal fracturing of self.
Okay, I understand why you'd be drawn to the clinical language the text uses, especially Deering's own anxieties about memory loss. I certainly see that. However, I believe that while the language of madness and memory loss is definitely present, Mr. Deering's transformation into Edmund Gray functions primarily as a profound symbolic representation of suppressed ideological dissent. The core distinction between these two personas isn't merely behavioral. It's deeply philosophical and political. Think about Elsie's incredibly astute observation.
Yes, Elsie's view is key.
Right. She says, Mr. Deering believes in the possible wickedness of everybody. The other man believes in the actual goodness of every man. Mr. Deering considers property the only stable foundation of society. The other man considers property the root of all evil. I mean, this isn't just a random delusion. It's a fully formed, coherent, radical counterself that Deering, the pillar of the city, the respectable solicitor, simply cannot consciously embody. The very notion of this madness provides a kind of narrative veil, doesn't it? It allows the author to explore these really subversive ideas that would be entirely unacceptable coming directly from Deering's conscious mind, thereby offering a critique, I think, of the very society that would necessitate such a split.
And yet that split also has such clear physical manifestations, doesn't it? It goes beyond just memory or philosophy. Others observe distinct physical and behavioral changes in Deering that align, perfectly with a fragmented mental state. George Austen, Deering's partner, sees him walk in his sleep, at noon no less, with eyes that went through George in creepy and ghostly fashion. It's presented as not just a philosophical shift, but a physical one.
Creepy and ghostly, yes.
And Elsie, his ward, notes that when he transforms into Edmund Gray, his coat was unbuttoned, his face wore the genial and benevolent look. The eyes were Mr. Deering's eyes, but they were changed, not in color or in form, but in expression. She then makes a very clear and direct conclusion. Mr. Deering has periods, whether regular or not I cannot tell, when he loses himself and becomes, in imagination, another man. He is mad, if you like, but there is method in his madness. This framing, both by someone as close as Elsie and then reinforced by Athelstan Arundel's journalistic experience with asylum patients who apparently seem to assume another mind with other memories, it explicitly grounds the condition in a recognizably psychological realm. It feels less like pure symbolism and, more like a documented, observed condition.
I see what you're highlighting there, those outward manifestations in the explicit language of madness. But I'd argue that the context of Victorian society, as depicted in the Ivory Gate, is absolutely crucial here. This society placed immense pressure on conformity, especially concerning wealth and status. The Arundels, for instance, openly and without disguise worship the great god Plutos, and the typical city man's philosophy is spelled out quite bluntly. A man's first duty, his second duty, his third duty, his hundredth duty is to himself. This isn't exactly a society that tolerates deviation easily, is it?
No, certainly not.
And in Dering's life, described as one where he was never, even as a young man, greatly attracted to love or to young women, suggests a life of, strict adherence to convention, leaving very little room for personal passions or heterodox ideas to surface consciously. So for Edmund Gray's socialistic dream, which was first dismissed by Sir Samuel Dering as like a socialistic tract, and then later by Dering himself as feudal doctrines, mischievous doctrines, for that dream to even exist, it had to be relegated to this mad state, this unconscious realm. It seems like the only acceptable outlet for such thoroughly unacceptable views in his waking world.
That's a compelling point about societal pressure, I grant you. But let's circle back for a moment to the memory lapses themselves. It feels like more than just a convenient narrative device to allow for forbidden thoughts. The extensive documentation of Dering's inability to account for, say, 3-hour periods or entire evenings, and his very real distress over it. I forget everything now, the things of yesterday as well as the things of today. Doesn't that provide strong, almost empirical evidence for a literal cognitive impairment? When Checkley observes him, he notes, sits down in a dream, walks about in a dream. Some of these days he'll do something in a dream. And Elsie's observation that he generally arrived in the morning in that state reinforces the involuntary, reoccurring nature of these episodes, almost like a genuine medical condition. This isn't portrayed as a character conveniently forgetting. It seems to be a profound, involuntary disconnect from his own actions, causing him genuine anguish.
Okay, I'd push back slightly on the idea that the anguish or the memory loss itself points solely to a clinical definition. While the memory loss is undeniably part of the story, its function within the narrative is, for me, far more significant than its precise clinical label. This forgetfulness, this blankness, is precisely what allows the Edmund Gray persona to operate completely unburdened by the social constraints and the very precise legalistic mind of Mr. Daring. It becomes a kind of psychological escape mechanism.
An escape mechanism?
Yes. The narrative device of Deering being unconscious or dreaming provides a protective shield, effectively, for beliefs that would be absolutely career-ending or socially ostracizing for the real Mr. Deering. His madness isn't just about forgetting things. It's about creating an alternate space, a necessary space for forbidden thought and action that Deering's conscious conventional self simply can't countenance. It's a convenient, perhaps necessary narrative construct to allow for radical critique without directly compromising Deering's social standing. And the anguish? That could very well be the psychological toll of that internal division, a division forced upon him by the society he inhabits.
A construct? Consider Elsie and Athelstan's interpretations again. Elsie, who spends significant time with Edmund Gray, very clearly frames her discovery in psychological terms. Mr. Deering has periods when he loses himself and becomes in imagination another man. He is mad, if you like, but there is method in his madness. Now, this isn't a casual observation. It's presented as a conclusion drawn from careful watching.
Right. Method in his madness is the key phrase there, though.
True, but then Athelstan, drawing on his journalistic experience, reinforces this by citing a physician who states, "There are thousands of men and women who are mad every now and then and don't know it." And crucially, this physician also clarifies, this is no Hyde and Jekyll business. Whatever happens must be conducted with the same body and the same mind. This direct reference to, psychiatric understanding within the narrative,
the specific mention of another mind with other memories, it strongly supports a literal interpretation of Dering's condition as a complex mental illness, one that perhaps maintains some internal logic rather than just being a narrative metaphor.
That's a compelling argument, especially bringing in the physician's perspective from Athelstan's memory. But when Elsie says he is mad, if you like, but there is method in his madness, the method part is what I find so crucial for my interpretation. The method isn't just random mental activity, it's the articulation of a coherent, albeit radical socialist philosophy that is diametrically opposed to Dering's own conscious views.
And the physician's quote you mentioned also states that patients never show knowledge other than what they have learned before, which actually implies that Gray's ideas originate from Dering's own intellect, even if they are deeply repressed. This isn't some foreign entity speaking through him, it's Dering's own repressed thoughts finding an outlet, the only outlet available. The narrative seems to use the framework of madness as a vehicle to explore these ideas without necessarily endorsing them as Dering's conscious choice. And the very act of portraying a respected figure like Dering as potentially mad, simply for holding socialist views, well, that speaks volumes about the societal repression of such ideas, doesn't it? It makes the madness itself a symbolic critique, rather than purely a clinical diagnosis. It's the only way those ideas could manifest in such a rigid conformist society.
So if I'm understanding your argument correctly, the physician's statement about not showing knowledge other than what they have learned before actually strengthens your point that it's suppressed thought rather than a literal break with Dering's own mind. That's an interesting reframing of that quote. But let's look at the ultimate purpose and resolution, or lack thereof, of this dual identity within the story. The narrative's conclusion focuses very much on Elsie's desire to cure Mr. Dering, right? To restore him to his singular, respected self, specifically by getting him to acknowledge his actions as Edmund Gray. Her primary goal seems to be to alleviate the terrible humiliation of him finding out he has been mad.
The humiliation, yes.
This really emphasizes the personal tragedy and the, let's say, medical dimension of his state, rather than celebrating the ideological freedom of his alter ego. The final scene, where Dering attends Elsie's wedding, looking every bit the part, his coat buttoned, his face keen and hard, the family lawyer stamped by nature and long custom, only to briefly become Edmund Gray again and wish her happiness. It highlights the enduring, almost tragic nature of his affliction. It reads like a personal burden, a condition he can't escape, rather than a fully integrated, conscious duality. The ending doesn't really resolve the ideological conflict, but rather reinforces Dering's continued involuntary split, suggesting it's an illness he must simply live with.
Well, I'm not entirely convinced that Elsie's sought-after cure is purely medical in intent. I'd argue that the cure she seeks is much more of a societal imperative, really an attempt to erase the inconvenient truth of Dering's radical alter ego. Elsie, despite clearly being drawn to Gray's benevolence, ultimately works to smother up the scandal, as the text says. She's protecting Dering's reputation and, crucially, the established social order.
Protecting the order.
The whole reconciliation between Dering and his family is entirely contingent on the suppression of the Edmund Gray identity, and, importantly, the associated charges against George and Athelstan being dropped. This suggests that the madness serves as a powerful narrative device to externalize the intense internal conflict between societal expectation and individual or perhaps subconscious conviction. The author uses this split, I think, to critique the very structures that necessitate such an internal division, showing how a person can be deemed mad by conventional standards, yet simultaneously be the mouthpiece for a deeper, perhaps more human truth that society would otherwise silence. The ending, where Dering briefly slips back into Gray, for me, that isn't just about a persistent illness, but it speaks to the enduring, irrepressible nature of those underlying beliefs, however buried they usually are.
The curious case of Mr. Dering and Edmund Gray truly presents a rich tapestry for understanding identity, sanity, and societal influence. For me, the extensive documentation of memory lapses, the consistent physical and behavioral observations from multiple characters, and the explicit framing by figures like Elsie and the referenced physician all point overwhelmingly to a literal, if perhaps complex, psychological affliction. It's presented as a personal tragedy, profoundly human, that a man of Deering's stature should suffer such a fracturing of self.
And I believe that while the surface narrative certainly uses the language and tropes of psychology, a deeper reading reveals the profound symbolic weight of his transformation. The stark ideological contrast between Deering and Gray, coupled with the depiction of Victorian society's rigid intolerance for radical thought, makes Gray the undeniable voice of Deering's repressed convictions. It functions as a sharp critique of the Ivory Gate itself and the immense pressures it places on individuals. The narrative cleverly uses madness not just to describe a potential condition, but more significantly, to speak an uncomfortable social truth.
It seems we continue to see different, though I think equally compelling, facets of this intriguing character's story.
Indeed. Whether viewed primarily as a medical phenomenon or as a pointed social critique, the narrative undeniably deepens our understanding of how individuals grapple with conflicting internal worlds and powerful external expectations. It really compels us to consider that fine line between what society deems mad and what is merely unconventional, or perhaps inconvenient, in a world that often prefers conformity to challenging thought.
Absolutely. We encourage you to revisit the Ivory Gate and ponder for yourselves where you believe the truth of Mr. Deering's dual existence truly lies.